Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? How can we get more people gaming and doing open source? Very fun questions today. I'm your only host today, Richard Littauer. Hello, everyone. It's me again. If you don't like me to be on here and you prefer a different host, you should email us and let us know. The email will be at the end of this podcast, which is further reason to listen to the whole thing. But I do have other people to talk to today, which is great. I'm really excited to talk to both of them. I'm joined today by Jonathan Romano in Syracuse, New York, and by Thomas Karagianes, who is joining us from Sacramento. Jonathan, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Doing good. And Thomas?
Good. Excited to be here.
Excited to have you. They are both developers on Eterna games. Jonathan is joining us today from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in Syracuse, and Thomas from Stanford, a small university on the West Coast. And they're both part of Eterna Game, which is a whole thing that leads to scientific discovery by doing gene splicing or something. I'm probably not the person who should give the elevator pitch. So one of you, tell me what Eterna Game does.
Yeah, I think the upshot is solve puzzles and contribute to research. The idea is that you can come in having no prior background in science or biochemistry, and just by playing the game, solving puzzles, you're able to contribute to research. And specifically RNA is the focus of our platform. You may have heard of a other game that's sort of like us called Fold It, which is focusing on proteins. And we actually share a lineage, but that's just another similar project in our neck of the woods. Those listening may have heard before. So if you haven't heard of us, you might have heard of them.
You solve puzzles for science. RNA was mentioned. So basically, I go onto your site and I play Sudoku, and then science is won and I get a Nobel, right? What's the difference between what I just said and what you actually do?
It's not that far off. I kind of like to describe our puzzles as an adversarial Sudoku. It's tricky, but it's very exciting.
I think to give some context here, kind of historical context is super helpful. For those who aren't familiar, RNA, single-stranded molecule. I think a lot of people are more familiar now with mRNA vaccines and whatnot. They've at least heard the word. But what's unique about RNA as a biological molecule is that because it's single-stranded, unlike DNA is double-stranded, it binds to itself, right? Those complementary strands. With RNA, you can get similar binding, but to itself. So the strand will actually fold, and cytosine binds to guanine, adenine to uracil. And so you can actually get this complex structure that gets formed from this single-stranded molecule that folds around and binds to itself. Now, when we started back in 2011, 2012, computers were not good at figuring out the structure from the sequence. If you knew the sequence of A's, G's, C's, and U's, computers had a tough time figuring out how those stuck together to make a particular secondary structure. It's what we term it. And kind of the insights of our kind of founders was, well, humans are really good at this. They're good at pattern matching. They're good at figuring these things out. And so the original puzzles were, here is a secondary structure. Here is a formation of the molecule we want to build. You tell us what sequences will work, what A, G, C, U sequence will actually make that structure. And then I think what's kind of really unique about Eterna, we take those sequences provided by our players and we test them experimentally in the lab. So we actually, when someone submits a solution to one of our puzzles, there's a high likelihood that that will be generated, actually synthesized and tested in a lab at Stanford. And the data, when it comes back, will go back to the players. The players use that to make new predictions, new insights. They make better designs. And it's kind of been this virtuous cycle that's been running for over a decade now.
And is it open source?
Yes and no. It's certainly open science. I am in tune enough with the open source community to know I should not just say yes to that question. A number of aspects of our software are truly open source. Not all of it, though. Some of it is private, actually, for silly reasons. Eventually should be made more openly available. But there's just technical limitations on that. But other parts of our software are not open source, but they are source available and free for non-commercial use. And that's in our ever continuing quest to figure out how to keep our project sustainable and get to the point where we can continue doing bigger and better science and engaging the public to do it.
So tell me about the size of your community. How many people are online playing games? How many people contribute to development? And how many people are on staff at Eterna Games?
Our total player base size over the past decade or so is, I believe, over 100,000 now. Our active users is not quite so impressive. We have a real core group of 30 or 40 folks, I think, who actively engage in our scientific challenges. And that's actually part of our sustainability. Some of the things that we're working towards for sustainability is the sustainability of our community and being able to increase that and grow that. On staff, we have primarily just the two of us as software engineers, part-time community manager, an additional individual who's worked with us for a long time doing designing and media work. And then in the lab that we are currently housed under, there are, would you say, half a dozen or so?
Yeah, it depends on how you count it, but probably 6. Yeah, I'd say probably 6 different researchers who at any one time may be running experiments for the Eterna platform or doing work in that respect.
And that encompasses the PI, postdocs, graduate students, research assistants.
It's huge. 100,000 is a lot of people. That's awesome. And I think 30, 40 active participants actually isn't that far off from the normal amount of percentage of people who are, okay, cool, I'll stick around and I'll do all this. Other community science platforms like iNaturalist also have this sort of weird distribution, right? Where you have a ton of people who joined during the pandemic, maybe saw a hummingbird and put it online. And then you have the 2 or 3 people who have identified 100,000 hummingbirds from every single photo of hummingbirds ever, which is pretty great. It's kind of cool, but it also leads to this weird skew where you have these really incentivized people who are really active, and it's hard to figure out how to get the middle. How do you tend to try to do that? What are you doing to sort of build general interest in having more users who are just a bit more incentivized to hang out? How are you doing that?
We've approached it from a couple different aspects. I'd say one, I guess it was a few years ago, but there was an effort specifically. I'd argue that one of the biggest difficulties with Eterna is that the barrier to entry for non-technical, non-scientific users can feel daunting when someone comes into the platform. Particularly back then, our tutorial system was complicated and very long. So there was a lot of effort put into, okay, what do we actually need to teach? And how do we do this progressively and slowly bring people along without overwhelming them? When you start to get into some of the weeds of the people who have been doing this for a decade, they almost have their own language, their own terminology. It can be a little difficult to get involved there. So there's some focused effort actually being put towards making it easier for people to get in, even though it can feel like wasted effort, right? You're not building brand new features. You're doing something, you're working on a tutorial system. Don't we already have a tutorial system? But making solid effort on being approachable and kind of, here's how to get into the game. Let's simplify things and really only bring in new concepts when we need to and when it's relevant. On the other side, I think one of our kind of more productive outreach efforts to some extent has been, we have a lot of classrooms who use Eterna as a teaching tool. We don't necessarily get a lot of middle school, high school, college kids to stick around super long term, but when they come in as part of a group and as part of a class, we always end up with a few folks who stick around, who learn new things, who engage with whatever lab happens to be going on at the time. We've actually, in the past couple of years, we've started doing kind of actual in-person outreach. So we've been to Cal Day, at Berkeley's Cal Day. We were just recently at a Oakland science fair. And so I think just getting out there and getting in front of people and really focusing on how does a new user experience this site? How can we make it easier for them to get involved and engage with the community? Yeah, it's been, I think, okay.
It's a continual work in progress.
How often do you see people be longtime contributors in terms of users of the platform, become code contributors to the platform, or become involved in things like research? Do you have a pipeline where people who come up with a molecule end up getting publications, references, or authorship?
Oh, yes. That's actually true in a lot of different facets. So minimally, whenever there is scientific publication that comes out of Eterna that involves contributions from players, not only do players get a little badge on their profile, but there is a consortium author on the paper, which is Eterna players. And that will include everybody who has, for example, submitted a solution to the puzzles that were involved in this particular piece of research. From there, if they are more deeply involved and contribute a greater amount, they might even become co-authors. And we've even seen papers where players are lead authors or even sole authors, which this is the first time that we're aware of that game players have been sole authors in a peer-reviewed academic journal, which is very exciting. But that's a really special thing about our community, I think. And from the code perspective, I think I am an interesting example. And in that I started as a player when I was in middle school. And then going into my senior year of high school, we had an annual conference, which is actually partially organized by players. It was initiated by players. And at that conference, I was actually giving a presentation partially discussing the future of our software and the potential of bringing things open source and things like that, and also talking a little bit about the history. And our principal investigator went, I'm noticing something from this little timeline you presented. Every year around this time, we have this thing that we do where we identify somebody in the community who we think would do a good job and would be useful and contributing to Eterna, and we give them access to our resources, our code bases, and whatever, and we let them contribute. Any nominees? And then someone pointed to me, and then a couple people agreed, and I was thrilled. I thought I was coming on as a volunteer. Turns out I was getting paid. I saw it as a bonus, but it's definitely been kicked off a really exciting ride for sure. And this isn't new either. There are a number of individuals on staff who have come from the player community. I am one in a line of Eterna's developers who were originally Eterna players, one of which I think may have been accidentally given access to code repositories, and that was just the easiest route forward, if I remember his story correctly. Another they were looking for a maintainer, and they put out an open call, and he applied to the job, and he wound up being the best candidate, especially with his experience already with the platform and just his technical capability in general. So
it's really cool to see how like a middle school thing just ended up being your job. That's the best. That's really, really rare. That's not common at all. So that's a great use case. I also like the idea of once a year choosing someone from the community and saying you get access to all the resources, because it seems like you're really valid here. Instead of just giving an award, it's more substantive. The timeline of that makes it seem like Eterna is this eternal project. It's been going on for a long time, and it's very well funded, and it's very stable. But behind the scenes, that's always not the case. Can you tell me about the funding of the community in general and how that's worked over the years?
Historically, the project has been grant funded to support both the staff working on the game itself and the research. I'll say best staffed from a development perspective, in that it was a team of grad students working on it. And then there was another grant that was pretty early on that wasn't necessarily supporting the original team, but additional developers who came on afterwards. And then there was a lull for a while where there wasn't a lot of active resources that were able to be put towards a project. Kept going, certainly, with the running on a half a developer for a couple of years at a time, or just doing what needed to keep things running and to continue the research. And there's definitely this pattern of, and you can even see it in the code if you know what to look for, where it's kind of passed from grad student to part-time developer to other grad student to that kind of thing. Luckily, the principal investigator of our lab in particular has received a couple of grants, as well as his appointment as an HMI researcher, which has provided a larger amount of unrestricted grant funds, which has really helped to greatly improve our situation, where we're now in the great situation of having two whole full-time developers. Although I think that in order to really live up to our mission and our potential, I think being able to grow even more, I think, is something that we've been discussing a lot. And something that we're looking at in ways to expand, but also to do it sustainably so that we can keep doing the research that we're doing long term.
So because you're building a tool that allows people to come up with novel ways of taking pre-existing patterns and then showing if they can be used, it sounds to me like the kind of project that would be really ripe for AI hype, which is probably unfortunate, but it's definitely an avenue to take this. And it seems to me that a lot of people may be asking, well, can't an AI just do that? What's the point of having humans in the loop anymore? And I know this is a more recent question because that wasn't the case 8 years ago, but as we are now, that's kind of how the ecosystem is currently working. Can you tell me how you're responding to that ecosystem shift and what that looks like?
We're integrating AI, right? A lot of folks think of AI as going to replace the humans in these sorts of projects. And we've found that that just isn't really true. Last year, this was kind of an interesting space. We did a double crowdsourced project wherein we asked the Eterna community to generate a whole bunch of sequences that potentially form these complicated secondary structures called pseudoknots. And we don't need to get super into the weeds on what that is, but there's unusual sequences that we generated with the community, and we generated millions and millions of sequences with the help of our community. We took those millions of sequences, did a bunch of chemical experiments on them, generated a very large data set, arguably the largest data set of chemical mapping data ever assembled, and then took those sequences and that chemical mapping data to Kaggle and said, hey, everyone, we want to figure out how to predict the chemical mapping reactivity profile of an RNA sequence in an actual machine learning model. With that, we can use that to generate structure predictions and all kinds of other things. So we took crowdsourced data and used that to crowdsource an AI model. The resulting model was published in February, RiboNanzaNet. It's a pretty kind of state-of-the-art, cutting-edge artificial machine learning model for its foundational model. So there's a bunch of different kind of applications that it could be used for, but it understands RNA pretty well. However, it's, as is the case with lots of machine learning models, limited by the training data that it has. So when we ask it for things that it hasn't seen before, so for example, one of our projects that we worked on last year was an application of RNA called antisense oligonucleotides. It's a therapeutic RNA. RiboNanzaNet has absolutely no idea what to do with that because RiboNanzaNet's trained around binding to itself, what kind of structure, what's the chemical reactivity in that. The ASO challenge is how do you use this RNA to bind to DNA or bind to a protein, or there's a bunch of different ways that those sorts of things can be done. But I'd argue that the real value in artificial intelligence, and I think Jonathan will speak a lot to this because this is definitely one of his kind of bread and butter areas, that idea of hybrid intelligence, where we can have an artificial intelligence do some predictions, do various things like that, and we can have our players use that model to guide their own intuition and their own insight, where they say, you know, that I know what the computer is telling me, but it just doesn't jive with what I've seen in my 10 plus years of working on the platform. And I think we're already working on that. We've got our RiboNanzaNet model integrated in game, and we're already seeing players come to us with this particular sequence I put in doesn't look quite right. Whatever RiboNanzaNet's doing in the background, I don't think it's doing it right. So I think that hybrid intelligence mode, that's the future.
Yeah, I completely agree. And hybrid intelligence is definitely something I feel like it's an underused buzzword. I think that there's so much potential there in not just combining the combined power of human intelligence and machine intelligence, but also being able to get them to learn from one another. I think that's very, very powerful feedback loop. And you can just come up with things that you would never be able to do otherwise if you, I mean, I guess it is still taking advantage of both, but I'm going to include a couple links to papers for the show notes, which I found really enlightening for me personally, which I like to go back to and read. And I think another area on top of this idea of just you're making humans and machines partners because they just have these unique capabilities and you're able to build off of each other. I think another thing is a framing that we came up with a few years ago for what Eterna's role would be, given we develop automated tools as part of our research. Okay, how does Eterna fit? Low data problems is something that AI is not necessarily well adjusted for. And building a foundation model like we are with RiboNanzaNet gets you a step further. But human intuition is really powerful in being able to work in these spaces where it's more about intuition and using more creativity and things of that nature. That's another place where humans are really important in this process, is the unexplored areas where we haven't been yet, where arguably we even want to automate the things that we can't automate so that we can move on to more interesting things and take advantage of those automations to make the human end of it more effective and to, as I said, increase the ability to do more, better, interesting things.
In Neil Stephenson's book, ReamD, he has all of these players of a massive online RPG go around and play this game where they sort of identify weird things that are happening in the game. So they say that orc is moving is funny. And what they have on the back end is that they sold this to security companies and national governments and airports, where what they're actually doing is sending images of people walking through security scanners, and they're translating that into gameplay. And so they can use and crowdsource humans' abilities to see novel weirdnesses and anomalies and make that interesting for players to do. So I bring this long example up because it's a really interesting example of making something that's archetypically boring interesting for users. And you're talking about making puzzles out of things. And I play Sudoku like everyone else, but after a few months, I get pretty bored. And trying to edit and work with an AI, to me, also sounds like trying to edit essays from high schoolers over and over and over again, which is not a good way of living. And so, having been a high school teacher, and so I'm just curious, how are you continuing to incentivize people beyond the really core passionate community who already have it as part of their identity that they do this? What do you do to make it interesting for people to solve these puzzles, particularly when AI is involved?
We attract very specific folks, I think. I know a lot of players who take a lot of joy in breaking the model, who take a lot of joy in finding that edge case that shows everyone says the computer is so smart, but here, look at this. It didn't get this right. And so there are folks who just naturally move towards those roles, move towards those kind of breaking things, poking at the boundaries to see like, what rules do I have? What can I push on? Where can I break stuff? And then understand how I broke it and why it broke and that sort of thing. I think what's a little interesting in our case, and this is still an ongoing discussion, I would argue, one of the difficulties in general with this, with playing these puzzles and getting new folks in, is that the puzzles can be a little, at times, counterintuitive. Unlike most puzzle games, you're kind of being introduced to new mechanics over time and those sorts of things. A lot of our gameplay hinges on the whatever model is being used to make the prediction about what the shape that it's folding into is. And that's changed over the years. It used to be primarily these thermodynamics-based models. And so it was around free energy. And we had players learning, okay, there are these specific sets of sequences that you can use that will decrease the free energy. And so we had a lot of push in that way. One of our challenges right now is that the machine learning model approaches provide relatively little feedback to players. Outcomes of prediction, that's kind of what they see. We've been playing around with exploring different ways to kind of introduce, what about the certainty, right? How certain is the AI model? And maybe we can display that in various ways to players that makes it intuitive for them to understand. I know what it's telling me, but I also know that it's not very positive about what it's telling me. And so I do think that's an area that's going to continue to have a lot of active research. You're seeing it even now in the commercial space. Are chatbots really the best way to interact with an AI? Maybe in certain contexts, there's better interaction patterns, there's better modes to engage. And I think for a lot of our players, even that itself is fun. coming in and seeing, hey, the developers changed something. There's this new button, this new feature I can play with. And, I don't really like that. I'm going to write in the forum why that was a bad idea. And so I think engaging the players is easy when you engage them directly in the research process, right? We're constantly telling folks, here's what we just put out. We want your feedback. Did it work? Did it not work? What should we change if you have some insights into that? We get a lot of folks who want to engage and help in that way. The more you engage the community in all aspects, not just the end result, even the nuts and bolts of how the platform runs, we get a lot of community engagement there too.
I'll quickly call out a point that you made. I think explainable AI and understandable AI is something that I know that there is research going on about that. And this kind of goes back to some of the hybrid intelligence things, but I think there's a lot of potential there where it can really improve not just things like AI safety and those kind of concerns around AI, but also just the effectiveness of it as a tool. I think explainable AI is potentially really helpful. And going back to what motivates our players, I think another big thing is just the scientific output of our work. Players care about being able to contribute to novel, interesting, useful scientific research. The fact that we've been able to contribute to, for example, better COVID vaccines that can be more easily distributed to parts of the world where they wouldn't ordinarily be able to be distributed. Or one of the other prior projects we worked on was a low-cost tuberculosis diagnostic, which TB is the world's number one. There's a WHO statistic. I don't know if it's the number one cause of death or the number one illness or something like that. But being able to see that there is real benefit of the work that they're doing is really, really motivating to players. And there's been a number of studies on both our game and other citizen science games and scientific discovery games that not just follows a similar pattern, but actually shows that that's a pretty consistent trend.
I agree with you that people love contributing to science that is useful. Tuberculosis is the second after COVID, according to Wikipedia as of 2022. So it's a massive thing. And Mountains Beyond Mountains is a great book. If you haven't gone and read that yet, you should totally go read that. I want to add an asterisk because I suspect your players or contributors wouldn't want to do it if you were housed at giant unnamed pseudotech in Cambridge, Massachusetts. One of the nice things is that it's kind of an open source, grant funded, researcher run, not hegemonic, a hedge fund controlled, a large medical corp complex. Do you think my bias there is accurate? And how do you stop that from happening? How do you stop yourself from being bought by Aetna or some other?
That is a constant tension that's played out over many, many years in lots of different projects. Our most recent project with a pharmaceutical company took a lot of engagement with the players. Now, how do we work it out? Well, it's a nonprofit pharmaceutical company, and they're working on COVID vaccines that are meant to be distributed widely and easily. But that context of I'm volunteering my time and someone is using this my time to make a large profit in a way I don't feel is ethical. It's obviously very clear in our case, but I think it's true across open source in general, which is someone is volunteering their time and the product of their work could be used in ways that they don't feel comfortable with. At Eterna, we manage it by directly engaging with the community and talking to them. When we have potential partnerships with pharmaceutical companies, we work on, okay, what are the terms of this going to be? Are they going to be acceptable? I know we've turned down projects in the past because we couldn't figure out ways to make it work in an open, equitable manner. But there is a tension there. And there is always a tension there when you are stuck saying, yeah, but we could fund the project 2, 3, 4 times as much money coming in to do more labs and do more work and do more interesting research. And I don't have an answer to say, this is how to fix it. I have an answer to say, it depends, right? It's always a balancing act. And at different times, Eterna may answer it differently with different projects. I think, as is always the case with the open source world, engage with the community, lay it out there for them, explain, here's what we've got kind of in front of us. And we have kind of core players who We've got Eterna Players Alliance. We have core players who engage more directly in the leadership role of steering the project. But yeah, Jonathan.
One quick edit I think needs to be made. The pharmaceutical company that we've partnered with is not nonprofit. It is for profit,
right?
But they have a unique mandate on the openness of their technology. The vaccine that they're developing is very uniquely open in the amount of materials and technologies that they're publishing. They're not enforcing their patents, at least for some substantial period. I don't remember all the details. I think the information is on our website somewhere. But beyond that, it's a hard problem. And it's one that I don't think we've solved, and it needs constant attention and continual work to figure it out. It'd be very easy for us to just arguably stop caring and just kind of take the next check that comes into our door. But it's part of our principles and our values not to do that. And I think an important part of it is engaging players, the people who are doing this work. And some of it is just being careful and thoughtful and really thinking through what's going on, thinking through the implications.
That's really cool. I like that you mentioned your principles and values. And I like that you also mentioned that you have some contributors who are part of a contributor alliance or part of your governance network. That's awesome. I would love to talk more about that. I have a lot more questions in general, but we are running up on time, which is really unfortunate because I need to make sure that I think one of you needs to catch a bus. So with that having been said, where can people contribute and learn more about Eterna?
You should, first off, visit our website at eternagame.org, which is where you'll find information about our project and be able to go in and play yourself. And if you are interested in contributing to the software side of things, we have a GitHub, github.com/eternagame, and we are more than happy to engage with potential contributors. And the easiest way to get in touch with us is on a bunch of our repositories. There's a link to a Discord server that's probably the easiest right now, or throwing in issues or getting in touch with one of us directly is always a good shout.
Thanks so much for coming on today. It's really cool. It's a really interesting project. I can't think of one exactly like it except INAT, because I can't think of one that where users can actually become research participants directly. I know all eBird records, all iNaturalist records get added to GBIF, which is super, super awesome, but they're normally not cited as those people. It's normally cited as iNaturalist contributors, which is great. Thanks. That's totally obscuring the source. And so it's really cool to see an open source platform that also has open science principles. That's also working on open research and open publishing principles at the same time. It's like all the opens all at once. I don't know what you do when it rains if all the windows are always open. But anyway, that's really cool. Don't leave yet. At the end of every show, we have a spotlight part of the show where we point out other projects, people, or things, just as a fun nod to the people who got us here and the shoulders we stand upon. So what other projects can we shed light on? As host, I traditionally go first, just to really show the other people what I'm doing. I don't think I've ever said that on the show before, but that's why I do that, so they don't feel so afraid. Internet Archive is my spotlight today. The Internet Archive is freaking amazing, everyone. It is like the best thing ever. They're awesome. Their building is also really weird and cool. It's in San Francisco, and you should go there if you have to get a chance. But you should definitely go to archive.org if you don't know about it. And I'm spotlighting them today because they've been under a massive DDoS for the past week, at least, and it just sucks for everyone involved. I'm unable to do a lot of the research I do because a lot of the research I'm doing right now, under no direction, completely a rabbit hole, it's completely a side quest, but who cares, is on finding original descriptions of species from the 1800s and 1700s. And you can't find those if they're stored on archive.org, and archive.org is down. It's really hard to find books from the 1800s on the internet that aren't on archive.org. So just massive shout out to everyone there. They're the coolest people in the world. And I hope that they get the same amount of funding as governments. They really should. Jonathan, what is your spotlight today?
I am going to call out TXIRCD, a Python IRC daemon. It's just a little bit special to me because it's actually tied into how I got started with Eterna. I got started actually rewriting Eterna's embedded chat client, which is based on the IRC protocol. And that was one of the first bits of Eterna that went open source. I think it was maybe number 2. And TXIRCD is the server software that we built on. And as I wound up poking at it for various reasons to modify it, to understand it, that's how I learned some of my first bits of software engineering and different design patterns and things like that. So that was a couple of reasons why it's special to me. Also, it came out of something called Desert Bus for Hope, which is a really fun and interesting charity stream, I guess, where they play a defunct / never finished game that is extraordinarily tedious, but it's all for charity and a good cause and great people, great event. Do check that out.
Love that. Thomas?
Yeah, my spotlight is a tool called Bioconda. For those who haven't done a lot of work in scientific software, let me tell you, it can be an absolute mess. All kinds of different complicated build platforms. It can be very difficult to work with scientific research software. And Bioconda is kind of a community open source approach to how do we distribute scientific software, and specifically in this case, biomedical software. So a bunch of Eterna developed stuff like Eterna Fold, one of our folding algorithms, is released through Bioconda. It makes things really, really easy to work with and really, really easy to get access to the tools that you need. And so I am very much a big fan of anyone who can make deploying and distributing software easy for folks to get access to these tools. I think all these scientific research tools are really, really cool. And sometimes authors can hurt themselves by not thinking about how do I get it off my computer and onto someone else's. So Bioconda makes that really easy, and they've made my life much, much easier than it would have been at times.
Another common problem with getting some code off someone's computer to someone else's is actually just getting information from one brain to another. That's why we have language. Language is really great. It's a way of sharing shared symbols in my brain to your brain. And if you enjoy language and if you've enjoyed hearing it during this last hour, well, you could always tell your friends about the Sustain podcast. That would be really, really dope. So yes, if you're listening, like this, subscribe, tell all your friends to listen to it as well. If you have any feedback, you can email us at richard@sustainoss.org. You can also go see the show notes, read the research that Jonathan dropped in, go to podcast@sustainoss.org. And if you really want, you could follow us on Mastodon or LinkedIn or MailChimp, or you could go to our Discourse, which is also on the website. And if you really, really want, and you think this is super, super cool, you could always go to Eterna online and donate. Just straight out, just give them money because they probably need it. You know who else needs it? We do. You can go to opencollective.com/sustainoss/ I think there's another slash, but maybe not. I don't know if there's like a donate. Anyway, just go on Open Collective and just throw money at us. That would be really nice. And if you are in a position of power, which I know many of the listeners of this podcast are, you can convince your higher ups to just give us actual money as opposed to $10. That would be really, really nice. So those are my thoughts today. Jonathan, Thomas, thank you so much for coming on. This is a super, super cool project. Thank you for talking about some of the intricacies of it and how you keep it sustainable over the long haul. Best of luck. Keep the RNA folding or something. I don't know what a good sign off would be, but thank you again.
Was it C on the flip, right? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, it's a player thing. Jonathan?
Flipping bears.
Yeah. Inside the community, C on the flips.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.